On the edge of a now mostly dry river, the Sina, with a bustling city in the backdrop, this is the tomb of the king Ahmed Nizam Shah, after whom Ahmednagar, the historic city in the heart of Maharashtra, is named. In the late 15th century, the Deccan was a hotbed of action. The Bahmani Empire had weakened, and its court in Daulatabad was a hotbed of intrigue, with nobles split into factions. It is from here that one arm, the Dakkanis, or the sons of the soil, rose to establish the Nizam Shahi rule centered in Ahmednagar, their home. Architect and historian Pushkar Sohoni has spent the better part of the last 15 years studying the Nizam Shahs and what they left behind. He tells the tales of Ahmednagar and its Nizam Shahs and why he believes they played a pivotal role in the history of this region.
The Nizam Shahs had their roots in local lineages from the region. According to a number of chroniclers of the 16th and 17th century, such as Firishta, the Nizam Shahs originally were a Brahmin family of Kulkarnis from the village of Pathri, which is not too far away from Ahmednagar on the east. And we also know that Pathri is very special for the Nizam Shahs because time and again they wage battles with the Imad Shahs over possession of this village, saying we are willing to exchange a lot of things as long as you give us back this land. However, we do not have any way of proving or disproving the veracity of sources from the time. So as opposed to their contemporaries, the Qutub Shahs and the Adil Shahs, who initially claimed to have nominal roots stretching back to either Iran or Central Asia, the Nizam Shahs were truly indigenous, and in fact the whole dynasty was started by Ahmad Nizam Shah, whose father, Nizam Bahari, at the Bahmani court, was part heading the Dakhani faction. So he was a local Muslim who was resentful of the high positions that Iranian emigres seemed to get at the Bahmani court. Now this was a big factional fight that had been going on for several decades, and he finally conspired and plotted against Mahmud Gawan, the famous minister of the Bahmanis. And he knew that his position at the court was absolutely threatened, and he therefore also urged his son to declare rebellion and independence from the Bahmani kingdom. The son, Ahmad Nizam Shah, was a decorated Bahmani governor. He was a very valiant and illustrious general, and part of the reason he was a high commander at the Bahmani court was also because he had won for the Bahmanis almost all the forts in the northern Konkan, in the region that would be called the Mawals, the same region in which Maratha sovereignty was established a century and a half later. Ahmad Nizam Shah declared independence from his then capital at Junnar. The fort of Junnar, which today is known as Shivneri, was where he ruled from. And one of the most prestigious places in the Deccan was Daulatabad, without which you could never claim to have control over the northern Deccan. So every year, Ahmad Nizam Shah would wage a war against Daulatabad and run raids to try and capture it. And to make this journey more convenient, he founded the city of Ahmednagar in 1494 on the banks of the river Sina, from where he could campaign against Daulatabad easily. Now, Daulatabad as a fort was very important in the northern Deccan because it was the provincial headquarters for the northern Taraf or province of the Bahmanis. But before that, it was the place from where the Bahmanis themselves had declared independence. Fast forward to the 18th century, the Nizams of Hyderabad, the Asaf Jahs, would also declare independence in Aurangabad by being based in Daulatabad. Daulatabad had been the capital of several dynasties. So the Yadavas, very famously, who founded it. But then it was the second capital of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, who managed to shift his entire population from Delhi very famously. Later on, it was the capital of the Bahmani kingdom, from where within 2 years they then moved to Gulbarga and then later to Bidar. And eventually, with the demise of the Nizam Shahs of Ahmednagar, they were forced to seek refuge in Daulatabad and operate out of there, very famously under the regency of Malik Ambar. So the site of Daulatabad has always had a valency, whereby people believe that in order to control this big central Deccan region, you need control over Daulatabad. But that is on the worldly side. On the spiritual side, you do have Khuldabad very close by. Khuldabad, which was called Khuldabad only much later, was known as Roza. And this Roza was the place famous for having saintly figures for several hundred years. It was the spiritual center of the north central Deccan. And so this twin settlement of Daulatabad and Khuldabad became very important in marking the legitimacy of any kind of rule in this area. Now, the city of Ahmednagar was founded by the Nizam Shahs with the express purpose of making raids on Daulatabad till they captured Daulatabad. So when Ahmad Nizam Shah declares independence from the Bahmanis, a Bahmani army is dispatched against him, and they engage in a battle very close to where the fort of Ahmednagar now stands. And the battle site was named the Bagh-e-Nizam by Ahmad Nizam Shah after he won it. There is inside the main entrance gate of the Ahmednagar fort a dargah to Baba Bagh Nizam, Hazrat Bagh Nizam, which is a residual memory that this was the site at which Ahmednagar was to be founded. The fort of Ahmednagar came first, the city was founded later. So in a sense, Ahmednagar was already their capital city before they got control over Daulatabad. They also had the chance to shape it from scratch, which was something they were never going to have at Daulatabad. In fact, Ahmednagar, within 2 years of its foundation, according to Firishta of course, was rivaling Baghdad and Cairo in splendor. And whether it actually did or not, it is this kind of aspiration they had for their city that made it very special in their mind. Now, Ahmednagar as a city is also very unique because as opposed to the Qutub Shahs of Golconda or the Adil Shahs of Bijapur, the Nizam Shahs of Ahmednagar never live in the city of Ahmednagar. They instead build themselves a fort about a mile away and live in there. They do not have a palace in the city. The other thing that is unique about Ahmednagar is that the city has no big congregational mosque. All you have are small mosques which are either operated, owned or worshipped in by small occupation groups or by small residential wards. Ahmednagar is special for the Nizam Shahs because they can shape it, but they also ask all their nobility to own wards in the city, and each ward will be developed by a different court noble. So for example, the area of Ahmednagar called the Nemat Khani is where a very important man of standing, Nemat Khan Semnani, was awarded a large estate in which we know he built a mosque, a tomb for himself, a big portal, a hammam, a bazaar and so on, and we know this by means of an inscription that still survives at the site. Otherwise very little survives of these wards, but the names stick on. Ahmad Nizam Shah wanted to leave behind an enduring legacy, not just founding a kingdom but also founding a city, and he therefore, to memorialize himself, designed on the banks of the river Sina west of the city of Ahmednagar a mausoleum which is quite grand, surrounded by a big enclosure wall, hoping that this would turn into some kind of royal necropolis. But his son Burhan Nizam Shah converts to Shia Islam, and they become such devout Shias that the whole family after that have their bodies embalmed and sent off to Karbala. So apart from Ahmad Nizam Shah, not a single one of the Nizam Shahs is actually buried in Ahmednagar or anywhere in the Deccan for that matter. Ahmad Nizam Shah had a favorite elephant called Ghulam Ali, and there is a tomb on a high platform which is just outside the tomb of Ahmad Nizam Shah, leading people to believe that it was actually the tomb of an elephant, as though an elephant needs to be encased in stone above ground. Yazdani, when he was editor of Epigraphia Indo-Muslimica in the 19 teens, gave a reading of the inscription which suggests a confirmation of the story, but it has never been confirmed. There are several small stray tombs around the tomb of Ahmad Nizam Shah, and the reason people chose to bury themselves close to holy men or to kings was the belief that on the day of judgment, people who have a good chance of getting in will take along with them their entire entourage. It also has to do with the belief that being buried close to powerful people gives you a divine strength, barakat. The fort of Ahmednagar was completely rebuilt in the 1550s and 60s to make it much stronger, as gunpowder technologies had completely changed in the first half of the 16th century. Ahmednagar fort is very unique in that it's one of the very few circular forts that you have in India. The fort of Belgaum is another one. The island fort of Janjira, if you think of it, is another one. But of course, Janjira is a completely different story. The fort of Ahmednagar is round, surrounded by a very deep moat, and it has beyond the moat what is called a glacis or sloping land that slopes upwards so that any kind of projectile, gunshot that is fired at the fort does not hit the walls but goes over it instead. You also cannot gauge the height of the fort as you approach it because of this earthwork, these ramps. And therefore the fort looks very diminutive as you arrive on the landscape. In fact, sometimes you don't even see it. There is a story about a Mughal army which came down to the fort of Ahmednagar, but instead attacked the Bara Imam Kotla, an academy started by Shah Tahir Hussaini towards the north of the city. And that's because that had a fortified enclosure wall, and they thought this was the fort. They only knew that it was outside the city, and they attacked it. The fort has remained largely unconquered except for when the Mughals lay long sieges to it, and then it's handed over to the Marathas, and of course the British with their big guns and a completely impoverished Peshwa force managed to take. The architecture of the Nizam Shahs is quite different from the other sultanates. Firstly, in its extensive use of timber everywhere. So a lot of the buildings that you see, their palaces, have timber framing on the inside. And this might be to build buildings more expediently. You also see ornament that is different from that of their predecessors, the Bahmanis, and of their contemporaries, the Adil Shahs and the Qutub Shahs. The Sultanate of Ahmednagar also falls about half a century before Golconda and Bijapur, and so you don't have those 50 years of continuous experimentation from the 1630s to the 1680s. If you look at the buildings in Bijapur or Golconda, most of them are actually from the 17th century. Ahmednagar has a lot of, almost all the buildings are from the 16th century. These are formative years where you are trying to shake off all the stylistic attributes of the Bahmanis and trying to create your own visual identity. But you have influences coming in from everywhere. You have a continuous stream of men of letters coming in from Iran and Central Asia. You have artisans who are trained in local stone carving techniques, who for generations have used some kinds of ornament that gets repeated time and again. You also have moving artisans who seem to come from regions to the south, particularly plaster workers. So there seems to be a convergence of architectural styles, but also of craftspeople coming from all over. The real problem you have with all kinds of innovative architecture is designs tend to come from one source, and stone masonry traditions or masonry traditions come from another source. The latter are always local, but designs float around. So on a graph paper, which is available in the 16th century, you can easily move a design from Iran to India. You can draw it out on the ground, but the masons will not know how to build it. You can tell them how to build it, but what you will have is something completely new and novel. And there are some buildings of the Nizam Shahs which are completely Persianate in their appearance, such as the big palace called the Farah Bakhsh Bagh, which is done in the 1580s under the guidance of Nemat Khan Semnani. And there is a story about how an earlier palace stood at the site, but the king was advised by people who did not like his previous architect that the palace was too triangular, and the word used is musalsat or muthaltat in Arabic. And of course, when you look at a building, the only way you are going to perceive something as too triangular is in elevation, not in plan, which means that the original palace probably had the pyramidal roofs of the type you see on the small tomb in the enclosure of the tomb of Ahmad Nizam Shah. Farah Bakhsh Bagh is built on the lines of a plan type called the Hasht Behesht. What this implies is you have 4 sets of rooms in 4 corners of the building. These rooms are connected by long galleries that also serve as entrance porches, these big ivans, and in the center you have a big open space. Well, this is the same kind of design that gets used in the Taj Mahal 50 years after the Farah Bakhsh Bagh has been built. In Humayun's tomb, you have the same design, which is around the time that Farah Bakhsh Bagh is built. And so it's not a question of whether one building follows another, but how all these buildings are tied together in a common imagination of a much wider Persianate world. The other interesting architecture around Ahmednagar is really what you have are largely palaces, mosques and tombs. You also have a number of utilitarian structures such as bathhouses, hammams, and subterranean chambers cooled by wind towers. But let us start with what becomes an iconic building in Ahmednagar, the tomb of Salabat Khan. Iconic because it stands on top of a hill and is seen for miles around. And so way before you actually see Ahmednagar approaching from the south, you would see Salabat Khan's tomb. This is built, so Salabat Khan is a very important minister in the reign of Murtaza Nizam Shah. So this is the latter half of the 16th century. And Murtaza Nizam Shah is also known as Murtaza Divana or Mad Murtaza, because he was very whimsical and did things in a very flamboyant way on his own. He decided to retire to one of his palaces, Hasht Behesht Bagh, for a period of 12 years. And it was really Salabat Khan who was managing the whole kingdom, very ably, a lot like Mahmud Gawan did for the Bahmanis 100 years before. Salabat Khan was awarded large estates, including permission to build a tomb on top of a hill south of Ahmednagar. And he built this massive 3-storied tower, in the center of which is a single space 3 stories high where his cenotaph lies, and circling it are these big galleries which have viewing platforms where one can see, sit and watch over the countryside. So not only is it a site of pilgrimage to his tomb, it is also a site for picnics where people can come and enjoy the delights of nature, enjoy the air as it blows through, sit in the morning sun and have wonderful views of the area all around. There is a palace at a place called Manzar Sumba, about 10 kilometers northeast of Ahmednagar. The palace of Manzar Sumba also sits on top of a hill controlling the great plains towards Daulatabad. So any army marching from Daulatabad would have been spotted from there. You also have over there a pool in front of the palace which has a channel flowing out of it towards the landscape. And it's almost like an infinity pool where you have water slowly disappear into the horizon, which is a cliff going down towards Daulatabad. An absolutely delightful architectural gem in Ahmednagar is just south, close to Bengar, this little mosque called the Damdi Masjid. built sometime around 1562. It is believed that people who were employed in the creation of the fort or the rejuvenation of the fort contributed 1 dam each to construct this mosque, and really made it an outstanding example of the kind of stone craftsmanship that they had. It's a very modestly sized mosque, as most mosques in Ahmednagar are, but the rich ornament you have on it is quite without parallel. You have emulation of woodwork in the cornice and the brackets that support it in front. You have in stone small features, small bosses at the edge of the cornice, at the edge of the eaves, that look like little bells. You have a lot of motifs which might be common to temples in the region, because the same artisans are being used by the Nizam Shahs. I mean, stone making, stone carving traditions in India are very old, and you do have a continuity of crafts traditions, and so ornament you've been using for years, you will use even for new patrons. What you also have there are motifs which become ubiquitous. A particular one I can think of is seen in Maratha temples, it's seen in Mughal buildings, it's even seen on the tombs of the Siddhis at Janjira. Another thing you find a lot in Ahmednagar, which you find in places in Bijapur but nowhere else, are small niches inside buildings with triangular tops that almost look like you have small curtains covering a square niche. These become less ubiquitous through the 16th century, and later buildings do not seem to have them as much.
This is the old quarter of Ahmednagar city. Though crowded and dusty, you will still find some medieval monuments strewn here. But there is little to tell of the fascinating men and women who ruled from here. From the founder Ahmad Nizam Shah, who took on the Bahmani Empire, to his son Burhan Shah, who prayed in this Bara Imam Kotla and ruled for decades. Then there was Hussain Shah, who was the architect of the decisive Battle of Talikota, which sounded the end of the mighty Vijayanagar Rayas. And then there was the mad King Murtaza, who took a 12-year sabbatical during his reign to close himself within his estates here. Finally, the great warrior of Ahmednagar, Murtaza's sister Chand Bibi, who took on the might of the Mughal army sent by Emperor Akbar.
Ahmad Nizam Shah founded the dynasty and the kingdom, but his son Burhan Nizam Shah ruled for a really long time, for over 40 years. And his reign saw a very formative period in the kingdom. He was quite just, sensible. People always speak highly of him. When he dies in 1553, he is succeeded by his son Hussain Nizam Shah the first. Now Hussain Nizam Shah, interestingly, is also the first Nizam Shah Sultan of whom we have contemporary pictures. So he is pictured in a very important manuscript called the Tarikh-e-Hussain Shah, Badshah Deccan, which is a manuscript at the Bharat Itihas Samshadak Mandal in Pune. In this manuscript, you have several scenes of him sitting with his wife on the same seat in a garden, sometimes in a court, and then you have battle scenes that depict the Battle of Talikota, because that was one of the most momentous events in his life. It was personally very gratifying for him to defeat Ram Raya, because the two of them had had great animosity for a while. In fact, there is an incident in which he was to surrender to Ram Raya after a battle, and these battles periodically kept happening between all the sultans and the king of Vijayanagar and so on. Somebody lost, you usually paid a tribute, got away, war season was over, you came back the next year. And one battle that he loses in, he is asked to take a pan from the hand of Ram Raya. He claims higher caste status and asks for an ewer to wash his hands in after he's taken the pan, at which point Ram Raya is also completely enraged. And they have a whole series of insults to each other, ceremonial insults, courtly insults, diplomatic insults. And so to see Ram Raya defeated was something Hussain Nizam Shah would have really liked, and that's exactly what he did. Now, his wife, Khunzada Humayun, who is depicted in paintings sitting alongside him, already tells you what kind of powerful woman she was. And immediately after his death in 1565, she becomes the regent for the young son Murtaza and starts running the kingdom. Now, Murtaza gets enraged and basically rebels and manages to get power for himself. But it is suspected that he also erases the pictures of his mother from this album. So now what you see in the pictures are just ghosts of what would have been her portrait. And this would have been very unique, because how many instances do we have of the medieval sultanates where a queen would be, portrayed in a painting? Now, Murtaza Nizam Shah is very headstrong and he loves to do things his own way, earning him the sobriquet of Mad Murtaza. And though his reign is always thought of as the madman's reign, it is under his reign that the kingdom sees enormous expansion, not just in terms of territory, but also in terms of building campaigns. You have palaces being built, you have all kinds of art being commissioned. The most lavish paintings of the Nizam Shahs are from the reign of Murtaza, where he is shown reclining in all his grandeur. One of the things that comes about in Hussain Nizam Shah's reign is the Battle of Talikota brings a lot of wealth to Ahmednagar. In fact, if you look at all the surviving Deccan sultanates after the battle, they all start massive building campaigns. Of course, Hussain Nizam Shah dies a few years after the battle, and his son Murtaza will use this money to build all kinds of palaces for himself. The Hasht Behisht Bagh, which is a very strange palace campus with several buildings at distances between each other, has very few surviving elements now. One of them is a big gatehouse through which you access an octagonal pool, hence the name Hasht Behisht in this case, 8 paradises. All the sides of this pool, these 8 sides, had flower beds of different flowers, and in the middle of the pool is a 2-storied octagonal pavilion, and all the 8 sides of this pavilion have in front of them the spout of a fountain. This would have been a place of leisure. On the same campus you have, at a certain distance to the east, an enormous palace called the Lakkad Mahal, which unfortunately has been completely derelict for years and is being encroached upon by all kinds of neighbors. Also on the same campus you have a hammam that is completely underground with a badgir or a cooling tower on top. A badgir literally means a wind catcher, and towers like this, which you find very rarely in India, would catch wind, channel it down underground, creating cooling drafts. In this Hasht Behisht palace, right next to the gatehouse, attached to it at a later date, is a small hammam, leading to the speculation that when Murtaza Nizam Shah lived in Hasht Behisht Bagh for 12 years, he probably spent a lot of time around these buildings and used that hammam. So Murtaza was known for a lot of whimsical decisions, and his 12 years of self-exile in a palace were certainly following a pattern of things that he did. He was known to give lavish gifts to dancing girls, and the court had great difficulty bringing those gifts back. He also tried to kill his own son, thinking that the son was out to usurp his throne. He used to have fits in which his decisions were not rational at all. We can never be sure of why he might have done certain things, but the stories sure are very colorful. I don't think anybody before or after him is quite the same way. But Murtaza's sister, on the other hand, is the ultra capable, sensible woman who leaves her position as a queen in Bijapur to come and defend Ahmednagar when Ahmednagar needs it the most, against the Mughals in the 1590s. In many ways, the Deccan Sultanates were like an extremely dysfunctional family. They were constantly having squabbles, but yet they could effect marital alliances. So daughters from the Nizam Shahs would go to the Adil Shahs, from the Qutub Shahs would come to the Nizam Shahs, and so on. In fact, there were even marital alliances with Vijayanagar. All these kingdoms of the Deccan almost waged ceremonial wars, traded insults, did everything, but somewhere there was a cohesiveness to it all. Except for the rich, fertile agricultural belts, nobody actually wanted more territory in most cases. You made a raid and then you retreated at the end of the war season, because most of their soldiers across all these armies were part-time cultivators. Now Philip Wagner and Sanjay Subramaniam have both written extensively on elite migrations between all these states, talking of how nobility could easily move from one court to another and fit right in. And it's because there is a much greater shared court culture amongst all of them. And it is in this milieu that alliances are made, wars are waged, and nobody expected Talikota to be so decisive, where 5 of the kingdoms would gang up on one and defeat it. But as scholarship has recently known, this certainly was not an Islam versus Hinduism fight. I mean, let us be clear on that point. So after the death of Murtaza Nizam Shah, there is a lot of dissent in the kingdom of Ahmednagar, and you have a very strong faction at court, that of the Habshis, or the military slaves who have been brought in from Africa, such as Malik Ambar. They control a number of key positions. Changiz Khan is the Peshwar prime minister at one point, and they also band together as a unit, offering their faction in intrigues at court. The other rising faction is the Maratha faction, who also have been neglected throughout, and they have also begun asserting themselves. And in fact, it is 2 of these, one Malik Ambar and one Shahaji Bhosle, who will go on and try to revive the Nizam Shahi in the early 17th century. But after the death of Murtaza, this factionalism becomes so bad that there is a lot of internal strife. There is Mia Manju and Malik Ambar who run separate factions, and the Mughals are invading from the north. And when the Mughals come to Ahmednagar, Chand Bibi gives up her comfortable life in Bijapur, comes back to her birthplace, and decides to become the figure in the royal family who will unite all factions and fight against the Mughals. There is a valiant story of her where a breach in the wall of the Ahmednagar fort is repaired almost overnight as she keeps the Mughals at bay. Unfortunately, she herself falls prey to the factionalism and is killed by dissenting mobs in Ahmednagar after she has defended it. In 1600, the Mughals completely take over the city and fort of Ahmednagar, and the royal family is forced to flee to the fort of Paranda, which they will operate out of as their capital for a period of 3 or 4 years, soon after which Malik Ambar comes to the rescue as the all-powerful general in the Nizam Shahi army and manages to capture a number of key Ahmednagar territories back from the Mughals. In fact, he gets the fort of Daulatabad, where he shifts his capital. Though the city of Ahmednagar does briefly come under Nizam Shahi control later, it has completely become a shell of its past life. The royal family does not reside here anymore. There is no great commerce happening. This loses all kinds of importance. And it is not till the 19th century, when the British decide to station big garrisons here, that Ahmednagar is again put on the map. The 17th and 18th centuries are largely a period of decline or reversal for the city, because Malik Ambar then decides to found a new city called Khadki close to Daulatabad. The city of Khadki would later be called Aurangabad. And when the Mughals finally take over the whole region in 1636, they decide that Aurangabad with its nearby fort of Daulatabad are the right place for them as their provincial headquarters. So the Suba of the Deccan is ruled from Aurangabad, not from Ahmednagar. Through the 18th century, the fort of Ahmednagar does not possess the same kind of importance it once did. There is no royal family there. In fact, towards the end of the 18th century, it is held for the Marathas by the Shindes, who in 1803 are defeated by Lord Wellesley. And gunpowder technologies have changed, warfare has changed. Storming a fort like this is no big deal. And he manages to win it one fine morning. And there is a spot that marks the site where he had breakfast after he won this fort. This spot also has cannons cast by Rumi Khan, the great gun caster of the Nizam Shahs. The British turned the fort into a garrison. It serves a number of functions over time. It is once given to the Army Remount Department. There are some small scale excavations done in the 19-teens by the Archaeology Department in the fort, but no conclusive report was ever published. And eventually the British, because it's a secure place, decide to use it as a place for house arrest for a number of nationalist leaders leading the Indian freedom struggle, including Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel and Maulana Azad. Now, Pandit Nehru writes his absolutely fascinating discovery of India in the 3 years that he is imprisoned in the fort of Ahmednagar. Remember, it's in isolation. He has some people for company, but he is without the kind of vast sources of reference you would need to write such a work. But he manages to do it. So, Ahmednagar also gets used as a big camp to house prisoners of war from the First World War and the Boer War too. And so you have a lot of postcards sent out of Ahmednagar and to Ahmednagar from Germany. And the story of German soldiers interred in Ahmednagar really is untold and deserves to be told at some point. For cities like Ahmednagar, which have a changed importance now, they were important for being political capitals, for being vibrant mercantile cities. Now the importance is being an industrial supply city for the army, in having a railway station. But somewhere people in a city need to take ownership of their own cities. They need to be aware of the things that lie around them, why these are important, why the history of the city matters to people who live there. And unless this happens, we are increasingly going to see destruction of sites, sometimes willful, sometimes unintended through sheer neglect. It is not enough just to say that municipal or state authorities need to wake up and take care of things. I think being aware of things is the first step towards protecting anything. In most Nizam Shahi sites which are not protected by the Archaeological Survey of India, you do not have any protection or safeguards, but there is no basic maintenance like cleaning buildings of trees, repointing mortars and so on. And therefore, just through weathering, buildings are falling away. You also have things like timber being used in the construction, which is very often, let us say, borrowed or used by the citizenry for other purposes, hastening the decline. Now, Ahmednagar of the Nizam Shahs was very unique in that the kings never lived in the city but chose to have a number of suburban residences all around. But what was suburban in their period has now come well within the limits of the city as the city has grown. And therefore, what would have been an idyllic palace site completely set in fields is now lost in a morass of concrete that gets built around it. And we have seen a number of these sites where ceilings that were once intact have completely collapsed, large walls have disappeared, and you also see massive encroachment everywhere where people start appropriating space first by using it, then by building within it. And Again, there is no comprehensive listing of sites of importance in Ahmednagar.
On the outskirts of Ahmednagar, this once rich complex exemplifies the deep neglect of the city's heritage. Once a palace with opulent pavilions, today it is caving in. Elsewhere, the ever-expanding city is marching in on monuments. There is a field being ploughed at Ahmad Nizam Shah's tomb. What was probably the old palace of Murtaza Nizam Shah is dilapidated, and it is only a matter of time before all of this goes to dust. It is imperative to save the city's past before it is too late.